We are very excited to have Kerry Wixted join us tonight to present Croaks, Peeps, and Color, Exploring the World of Amphibian Communication. Kerry Wixted is a Maryland naturalist with over 15 years experience studying the flora and fauna of Maryland. She has previously worked for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and has taught classes for Nature Forward's Natural History Field Studies program. Kerry holds a BS degree in Wildlife and Fisheries Management from Frostburg State University and an MS degree in Biology from West Virginia University. And so now I'll turn it over to Kerry.
Thank you, Patty. I'm excited to be here to talk about frogs tonight and salamanders as well, especially since it's a great night for most of Maryland. There are things calling. The peepers definitely were very vocal out my way in Anne Arundel County about an hour ago. So I am going to talk to you a little bit about amphibian communication, not just things here in Maryland, but just other ways that amphibians communicate globally. And my name again is Kerry Wixted. I currently work with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. We're an NGO based out of DC, but we work with all the state fish and wildlife agencies across the United States. And with that role, I also am the state agency's coordinator for PARC, or the Partners of Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. And if you're not familiar with PARC, hopefully you'll be familiar with PARC after tonight and want to become part of PARC. But we're an unaffiliated partnership working to conserve amphibians, reptiles, in the places that we live. So I represent national park, but there's also regional parks, like Northeast Park is your region. And that's where a lot of the stuff happens, like on the ground and all of that. And PARC is part of ARC, the Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy. They're the 501c3 nonprofit that supports all the work that we do. And then we have lots of amazing volunteers that help out with different aspects of PARC along the way. So I probably don't have to talk to you too much about the importance of amphibians because you're hanging out with me tonight. But they function in many different roles, particularly as predators and prey in our different ecosystems. Some of them help with nutrient cycling. Sometimes we consider our more sensitive amphibian species as ecosystem indicators or canaries in the coal mine to let us know about things that might be happening in these aquatic environments. And then we can also look at some of these amphibians and reptiles as well in terms of advances in medicine and biotechnology, like how sticky surfaces on their feet work, how we might be able to use some of the things that they have in terms of venom to use it for medical technology and all of that. So lots of cool stuff with this group. And unfortunately, around the globe, around 40% of our amphibians are critically threatened. So amphibians communicate in a number of different ways. A lot of the ways that we probably think about are the physical types of communication, the things that we can see or hear. So that includes color and movement and sound. Some of them also communicate via touch. Of course, some of our amphibians also have chemical communications, and I'll be talking about how some of that works with some of our different species throughout the presentation. So the first group that I want to talk about is, with how amphibians communicate with color. And poison dart frogs are a great example of organisms communicating through warning coloration. And so Mullerian mimicry is when an unpalatable or not tasty species looks like another non-tasty species. A good example of that is the viceroy butterflies and monarch butterflies. Actually, both of them are distasteful to most predators. So that's an example of Mullerian mimicry that you might be really familiar with. But in the poison dart frog world, there are these poison dart frogs in the Peruvian Amazon that actually are a rare example of vertebrates, animals with a backbone that exhibit this Mullerian mimicry, because we mostly see it in the insect world. So the different color morphs here the different color morphs are present to mimic each other that live in these similar geographic areas. And interestingly enough, all four of these species here in the middle are the same species, and you can see very different color patterns to them, and that's because they're mimicking other frog species that are in those kind of overlapping habitats. So essentially, a predator only has to learn one color pattern in that habitat, and they'll know that both these frog species are not good to eat. And so there's been research that looks into, why this is happening and all of it, and it's really patterns of gene expression and gene variants that are causing some of this that's happening across those areas. So a really cool recent discovery in the world of amphibian communication is that some of them biofluoresce, and biofluorescence is different than bioluminescence. So biofluorescence is essentially the ability to absorb light, and usually it's ultraviolet light, but also it can be visible light, and then they re-emit that light at a lower energy level. For example, in salamanders, blue light from the sun and things and ultraviolet light is being absorbed by them and re-emitting as green. Now, we can't see this because we don't see on the different light spectrums that salamanders and a lot of our other wildlife see, but these salamanders actually glow and look like this out in the wild to each other. And so this is some really cool research that was part of Dr. Jennifer Lamb's work in the Northwest, and she's actually a park member. She's part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion task team, and one of our regional co-chairs at the moment. And she's the one who really helps understand a lot of this biofluorescence that occurs in our different salamander species. And since her research, there have been more people kind of looking into this and trying to figure out why. They're finding a whole range of our salamanders essentially biofluoresce that we had no idea was even occurring. And for specific species like the southern gray-cheeked salamanders, the most recent research has actually found that the biofluorescence patterns of the males versus females are markedly different. And so they're thinking that maybe some of this biofluorescence is a way for them to help distinguish between the sexes. So cool research still happening. Even though the salamanders do not look like this to us, if you shine a UV light on them, that's how they're going to look under a UV light. So really, really cool. Another way of showing off colors is this thing called the Unken reflex. And this is a defensive posture that's employed by some frogs, toads, and salamanders and newts, essentially to warn potential predators before an attack. So the Unken reflex is essentially arching your body up, and you can see this toad right here is curling up to show off its really colorful undersides and all of that. And essentially they're displaying these warning colorations and saying that I am not going to eat. So for individuals with toxins, sometimes they also release those substances in an effort to repel those offending predators. And some Unken reflexes are really extreme, and then some are also less dramatic. And so this is another example of what I think is a pretty extreme Unken reflex with a newt. So to the south of us in Panama, the Panamanians look to this really cute frog species, the Panamanian golden frog, as a symbol of good luck. And as legend has it, the frogs turn gold after they die, and anyone who happens upon these frogs actually will be blessed with prosperity. So unfortunately, these species are critically endangered frogs, and they're highly toxic, yet very social. So they actually call to other golden frogs and also make calls and hand gestures to other species. So they're really well known for their hand gestures. If you're thinking about these rainforest environments, really biodiverse, rich environments, the way that they get others' attention is they use these hand signals. So they move their hands around in different postures to let people know, or let essentially other organisms or each other know if they're friendly, if they're aggressive, if they want to fight. There are certain hand gestures that males do to, competing males across the way. And I feel like they already have that kind of angry look to their faces as well, but they pair it with the hands. So a whole new reason to, think about the phrase talk to the hand. So moving along to other salamanders with something to say, there are some salamander species that actually make noises. So vocalizations are pretty uncommon in the salamander world, but here are two species that are found in North America that actually make noises. So notably is the Pacific giant salamander, which, as you might guess from its name, not here in Maryland, but can be found up in the Pacific Northwest. And it actually makes barking and growling noises and clicking noises whenever it's threatened or upset. Similarly, the mud puppy, which is considered to be extirpated from Maryland, but still can be found in other places of the United States. This mud puppy gets its common name by making squeaking or squealing noises when they're distressed. And there are also aquatic salamanders that have these large feathery gills even in through adulthood. So they never leave the water, and you're mostly going to find them in parts of the central parts of the United States. So here's that Pacific giant salamander, and I'm just going to play this noise so you can hear some of the clicking and the growling that they do. That's an angry little salamander right there. So those are just some examples of the noises that they make. Now, moving along to frogs and toads, which obviously are much more vocal in terms of a group of amphibians. And so frogs, just like us, produce sound by passing air that they're exhaling out over their vocal cords. And they do this while they're also coordinating ventilation of their lungs. So they're doing a lot more than what we do in terms of making noise. Frogs also breathe differently than humans. So they breathe in air through their nose, and they actually expand the floor of their mouth in this process. And then they close off their nostrils and raise the floor of their mouth to kind of force that air into their lungs. And when it is exhaled, that's when it causes those vibrations within their larynx and all of that, their vocal cords essentially, and makes that noise. So when that air is exhaled, it produces that vibration, good vibration. The sounds are also amplified by passing air into the frog's vocal sacs, which expand, and they also have sound resignation chambers, which we don't have. These calls can vary quite a bit within a species, particularly with temperature and due to the body size of the frog calling. And because frog calls can really change with temperature and body size and all of that, that's one of the reasons why it's been really difficult to use sound identifiers like they're using with birds and bats, those auto IDs for frogs, just because of the variations in the calls that they do. So I'm going to go over some of the frog calls from local frogs. And the first one is one that is vocal right now. This is a wood frog. This is one of our earlier frog species that comes out in Maryland. And you can actually find them all the way up north into places like Alaska. And the reason that they come out so early in the spring, and you can find them in a lot of northern habitats, is because they have this really cool adaptation where they have extra glucose in their blood that almost essentially acts like an antifreeze in their blood. So they can freeze solid. It has to be gradual. It can't be a quick freeze, but they can freeze solid without having harm to their organs. So I'm going to play the noise. You can all hear the wood frogs. This is a very common noise that we hear this time of year. Technical difficulties. So I think a couple folks in the chat earlier also mentioned that they were hearing this noise. So wood frogs and spring peepers are out and about right now. They're some of our earliest frog species that are out and calling. And then some of our next round of frogs that you're going to hear, frogs and toads, are going to include things like our American toads and Fowler's toads. So in another couple weeks to a month, you're going to hear them and see them. So I'm just going to play this quick video. The two lighter ones are males that are competing for this larger female here. So in that video, you can hear the trill of the American toads. It's one of my favorite calls in the springtime because I just hear it. I love hearing it around my neighborhood and all of that. But if you listen earlier too, before my friend's son started screaming, "I got it!" when he caught one, is that you heard there's like this little disturbance noise. I'm going to play it again. And so that is a communication that males do with one another to let them know that, hey, get off me, I'm a male and not a female, or, while they're fighting over attention of a female. So I'm going to play this again just in the beginning. Listen for that trill, which is the normal, and then you'll hear that little warning call that they do. So those are those little noises, like get off me. Moving along to a few frogs that also call a little later, like our American toads. We have our pickerel frog and our southern leopard frogs, and these sometimes can get confused based on some of their similar kind of like patterns and all of that. So if you look at our pickerel frog, it's a little hard to see from this photo, but they have these distinct kind of rectangular patterns going down their back, whereas the leopard frogs tend to have more of these circular spots. And the pickerel frogs have like two distinct rows going down their back, whereas the leopard frogs don't always have them in those distinct rows. Of course, there are a few other things too with the coloration. You can see that kind of like line going down the leopard frog, but it's really easy to tell the difference between the two if you listen to the calls. So the pickerel frogs have this snore-like noise. Play it. So a very different call than a lot of our other local frog species. So sometimes they have some grunts and some garbles that they throw in there, but typically what you're going to hear from them are those snores. The leopard frog, in contrast, is a lot more guttural. It sounds like clucking almost, or some people call it a clucking trill, and liken it to a little bit more like an inflated balloon. And of course, in the background, you can hear something that sounds like somebody's running their finger over a comb, that noise that goes up. That's actually one of the chorus frogs that you can hear in the background. So moving along to some other frogs, the cricket frogs are definitely much later than the other species that I played. These are found throughout Maryland, and they sound like, somebody kind of clicking pebbles or marbles together. These are really little frogs, so they're only maybe like an inch and a half or so. And this isn't the best photo for identification. I'm proud of it. I took it. But they have this dark triangular patch between the eyes, and that's usually one way that you identify them. You're going to find them in a lot of ponds and lakes and places like that, and they can be found in semi-urban areas. And again, they make that kind of clicking noise. That is not the noise. That is it's like, wait a minute, that's not the cricket frog. Let me play the cricket frog. The clicking. Okay. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, on the eastern shore, I think Nancy said she's over on the eastern shore. In some areas, you'll hear our carpenter frog, which is a little more uncommon in the state. And this one sounds more like it's saying like rick up, rick up, rick up. You hear the rick up, rick up. So the different sounds that you're hearing too, as I said, body size can play into some of these calls. And smaller males are actually going to have higher pitched calls of lower intensity relative to the larger males. And so, that again is one of the reasons why some of these auto IDers for frog calls just haven't been able to work just yet. Moving along to another one of my favorite calls that you don't often hear is the eastern spadefoot toad. And so they're considered to be what we call a fossorial species. They spend most of their time underground, and their tools of the trade to do that is this little spike that they have here on their feet, that little spade that they use to help with digging into the ground. But on warm, rainy nights and later in the spring, so tonight might actually be a good night because it is pretty rainy, they will all come up to the surface, and they have what is known as explosive breeding, where all of them just start breeding all at once, and then they just disappear. So yeah, it's something that's really, really seasonal, and it's easy to miss. But in my descriptions, I think that it sounds like their noises is like a wah, like think about like a sheep that's whining or having a bad day. That's the noise of a spadefoot toad. So let me play that for you. Ah. And just imagine like hundreds of them all at once, like going rah, wah, wah. And sometimes they'll do this in just like pond, like the little, pools on the side of the road because they're doing that explosive breeding. So they're often doing this together. So listen for them. They like to live in areas that have sandy soil. So there's something that you're going to see a lot more on the coastal plain here in Maryland. So one tool that I actually have in the Wakelet that the link that I'm posting is this resource that we developed with Park. It's called Frog Talk, and it's designed where there are the cards that have the names of frogs, and then in green here you can see like the description of the noise, like green frogs sound like you're plucking a banjo string, like dunk, dunk, dunk. So we made that, and we have some information about the noises. And then the activity is designed where people walk around and make those noises, dunk, 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 or wah, and they have to make those noises and find the frog that is making the same noise. So it's a really good icebreaker activity that also teaches you about the frog calls, and it's something that you can find online. So last call that I'm going to talk about is an animal that we don't have here in Maryland. It's over in Africa, but I can't talk about frog calls without playing the angry squeaky noise of the desert rain frog, which is found in the area between Namibia and South Africa. And unlike a lot of other frogs, it actually skips the tadpole stage. So it goes from eggs to adults. And part of that is because it's found in these desert areas. And so it has to explosively breed in the few times that they get water. And so they have to be able to live in foggy dune habitats and live with very little water. So listen to this formidable squeak.
But sometimes more unexpected sounds grab our attention. Like this desert rain frog. Squeaking viral sensation.
So adorable, so adorable. So it sounds like a squeaky toy, and I would love to hear them and see them one day. So it's really important to note that calling takes a lot of energy and requires high levels of aerobic respiration. And it's usually done during this time of year, essentially to attract potential partners. It's a way to, because it requires so much energy, it's a way to kind of show off your potential fitness. And one record calling frog species is the small-headed tree frog, and it can actually produce up to 100 notes per minute for several hours, requiring up to 25 times more oxygen while it's calling than on its normal day-to-day things. So really, really wild. So some frogs also use things like leaves or water, artificial areas like our pipes you might have had, you know, frogs sitting in your drains off of your roof and all of that, and those storm drains, because they use that to amplify noise. They even use things like trees. And so I'm going to play this quick video just so you can hear how this one's amplified. So it's trying to position itself in the best spot possible to amplify that noise. All right, we'll move along. This is another cool example of an adaptation. So this species of frog, the concave-eared torrent frog, lives in noisy places along fast-moving streams over in Asia. And to overcome the fact that it's already in a noisy environment and it has to call and kind of compete with other sounds, they actually communicate in ultrasonic frequencies. So kind of like, you know, in higher level frequencies like bats communicate in. So, excuse me, to be able to hear these calls, both males and females have these specialized eardrums known as, you know, the eardrums for frogs are called tympanums. They have specialized tympanums that are actually different between the sexes. So you can see the female is a lot different than the male, which is a lot more like inverted and all of that. And this allows them to hear differences among the ranges of the calls. So the males are going to hear different calls. They've got a smaller tympanum and all of that than the females, which are trying to listen for those male calls. So kind of cool that they're using that ultrasonic communication. And you might also be wondering, do frogs have accents? This was a question when I was putting this talk together. And so the answer is actually yes, they do have accents. So frogs from places that are further away from each other actually have been found to differ more in terms of frequency or pitches and all of that. And so yeah, they could, you know, what we call they could have what we call accents essentially. And then sometimes the calls made only a few days apart are more similar than those calls being made a month apart. So sometimes that call can actually change throughout the season. Another reason why it's really, really hard to do auto ID function on frog calls, but people are still doing it. So moving along, there are some frogs that dance to show off. And some of this dancing allows them to do long-range communication. So, see his little foot clicking there? He's calling, but he's also moving his foot. And so it's really subtle, but they'll have different ways that they move and different kind of like courtship dances almost that communicate different things, like whether or not he's mad at another competing male, whether or not he and a female are receptive. You see him like lifting up his foot. He is doing these different kind of dance moves and all of that and communicating in different ways. Just like that Panamanian golden frog with their kind of hand signals and all of that. So there are multiple forms of chemical communication that also occur in the amphibian world. And a lot of these, it happens within salamanders and newts because they don't use quite as much of that vocal communication. So a lot of these animals that are using these chemical communications have special glands And things like the mental gland are just like right underneath the chin. So some of our woodland salamanders, which are the plethodontid salamanders, those lungless salamanders, in certain times of the year, particularly like breeding season, you'll see these enlarged mental glands underneath the chin there. So a lot of the glands obviously are going to be on the males, but sometimes you do see them on the females. And sometimes we don't always know, what they're doing with those glands and those chemicals and all of that. So we still have a lot to learn. Very soon, we're going to see a lot of our eastern newts out and about, and eastern newts have both cloacal, which are, down here in the vent area. They have cloacal glands, and they also have cheek glands, so they're called genial glands. And they're known to supply or apply secretions to the female's nose by both doing this kind of like tail fanning that you can see here, and cheek rubbing during courtship. So you'll see the males kind of grab a hold of the females and rub all over them, and that is essentially to release those chemicals. So males and females also release chemicals into the water to indicate their presence and their breeding status, like if they're ready to breed and receptive to it and all of that. And interestingly enough, males will react to females, but not to other male chemical signals. And in this study that's in the Wakelet that I'll paste again, they also found that males obviously seem to prefer larger females. And so that's probably that, fitness context there. So one of our most common salamander species here in the United States is the redback salamander. And you can see a picture of it here in the typical redback phase, but also it comes in that leadback phase that lacks that red stripe down it. And there have actually been several research studies that have indicated the poop, or if you want to call it the fancy science term, fecal pellets, they from the male might actually help to indicate the fitness of that male. So like, sometimes the females will smell the male's poop and say, well, you've been eating really good, so you probably are a good mate to have because you'll make good babies. And so ultimately that poop can lead to, to mating. And so hey, they've seen this in other species too. They've seen it in these things called archaic frogs that inhabit some ranges, and individuals will actually distinguish between other individuals based on their poop. Which, when we look at other animal species, that's not quite that uncommon. Like you think about a lot of our mammal species, they signal through their feces as well. So it's happening in the salamander world too. Unfortunately, despite all the importance of the amphibians and the rich diversity that we have and everything, we are seeing our amphibians are in trouble due to a number of factors. Much like many of our other wildlife species, we see habitat loss and degradation as the number one thing, but certainly invasive species, those non-native species that are introduced into areas, can cause a lot of problems with our invasive species. And even some of our native species can become invasive elsewhere. And a great example of that here in Maryland is we have bullfrogs that are native to the East Coast, but particularly through the food trade and the pet trade, they were intentionally introduced to the West Coast. And now they're highly invasive in those areas, and they eat a lot of those smaller frogs and really change the diversity of the species in those areas. Because of that intentional introduction. So we have invasive species. Obviously, climate change is a really big thing that we're concerned about, particularly for some of these amphibians that are found in some of these higher elevation areas that have narrower ranges. And when I think about this locally, a great example of that is something like the Cheat Mountain salamander over in West Virginia, that's only found in a few areas, few of those higher elevation mountain areas in West Virginia. And so as the climate changes, it's really going to shrink the amount of available habitat for species like that. During this time of year in particular, but also just rainy nights in general, roads can be a huge hazard. And in some areas, there are salamander and amphibian patrols out. Actually, Jug Bay Wetlands Sanctuary has a amphibian patrol volunteer program where you can actually sign up and help amphibians cross the roads safely at night in some of these high traffic amphibian movement areas. Some of the things that I deal with on the national level is working with folks in the disease research realm and think about how to manage for different types of amphibian diseases. For example, rhinovirus and the chytrid fungus, BD, have really spread among our amphibian populations across North America and even parts of South America, and have devastated quite a few of them. And things like rhinovirus are actually, it's transferable to more than just amphibians. It affects other cold-blooded species like fish, and even some of our turtles, like box turtles, are highly susceptible to rhinovirus. So those are big things that are already on the landscape. And one of the things that we're doing with this North American BSOL task force, BSOL is another type of chytrid fungus, and this attacks the skin of salamanders, newts, and now we're finding frogs. It's over in Europe, and we're trying really, really hard to prevent it from getting introduced into North America, because over in Europe, they're seeing 90 to 100% decline of some of these salamander and newt populations that have BSOL. And we're really afraid because North America, specifically the Southern Appalachians, is the richest salamander diversity spot in the world. So we have a lot to lose if BSOL were to hit. And so we're constantly trying to get the word out about all of this stuff through the North American BSOL Task Force and other avenues. And some of the links that I've provided in this Wakelet actually have some disinfection procedures. So if you're going out to these breeding pools in particular, but anytime, it's just a good practice before you go out, disinfect your boots and your gear that you might be using, and disinfect it between sites if you're traveling to multiple sites in one day. So it takes a little bit of extra time and planning to use these bleach solutions, rinse off and scrub down your boots, but you're going to be preventing a lot of different diseases, not just herp diseases from getting passed around. You're also going to be preventing moving around invasive species as well. So it's just a really good practice just to start building into your everyday if you want to continue enjoying these different places and all of these species. Unfortunately, something I also deal with on the national level is just general apathy to our reptile and amphibian species in general. And some of them, when you think about things like snakes, are intentionally persecuted. But we can do a lot of good, right? So how many folks are here on this webinar? Like 70 something folks. It's 7 o'clock at night and you're here to learn. And I appreciate that. So I hope you can take some of this information, these cool factoids that you learned about how amphibians communicate and maybe some of these different noises that you heard tonight, and use that within your communities to end your, families and friend groups, and educate others and get others to appreciate and understand this amazing natural world that we have around us. For those of you that have any type of habitat, whether it be, flower boxes on your porch or, a little more land and all of that, the more you can do to put native plants out on the landscape in your communities, in your areas and all of that, the better it is going to be for all sorts of different species, not just our amphibians. And that also includes encouraging invertebrates, because unfortunately, mosquitoes are really important for a lot of our amphibian species. I'm not saying make it like a habitat that is, friendly to mosquitoes. But what I'm saying is think about your pesticide usage in large areas in your backyard and all of that, because you might unintentionally be killing the food sources for things like your amphibians and reptiles and small mammals and birds that might help with that natural side of pest control. So just consider that in the long run and understand that some of these invertebrates like snails and slugs, that's food for our local herps. So, those are things that are important for them and for them to eat. If you're, driving around and you notice something like turtles crossing the road, or again, our amphibians trying to cross the road this time of year, if it is safe for you and others, get them off the road and help them. But you always want to take them to the side that they're going towards, because if you put them back on the side they came from, they're just going to cross the road again. Other things just to keep in mind is not releasing pets and captive animals. It might seem like it's a nice thing to do, but that's how some of these diseases have got out on the landscape, is from released pets. So please don't, do that, because that can affect the disease dynamics in different areas. So one of the things you can get involved in that's really fun and a great way to help contribute to our knowledge of where these different types of amphibians are found is through projects like Frog Watch USA. So Frog Watch is a lot smaller than it used to be, but it's still active and still around. And I know at least Montgomery County still has a Frog Watch chapter locally. So check the Frog Watch website and see if there's a Frog Watch chapter near you. And if there isn't and you're interested, well, consider maybe starting up your own Frog Watch chapter to help listen for these different calls of frogs and record where these populations are. The other things I got to throw out there before I finish up is check out all the amazing things that we're doing at Park. We have Amphibian Week coming up the first full week of May, which is May 5th through 11th. We have an art contest that's going on now for the next month. So any students in the K through 12 age range can submit their amphibian art. We've got some really cool prizes with plushies and books and stuff like that. Everybody will receive a digital certificate for entering into the contest. We're also going to have some different events in the Washington, D.C. area at the National Zoo and also at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. So keep an eye out on our website as we put that information up. And we'll have a month-long bio blitz on iNaturalist. So more details will come out about that very soon. Can't forget the turtles too. Even though they're not amphibians, we also have a special Wild Turtle Week in June. And so check out our website for more information about that. So with that, I will take any questions that you might have. And I'm gonna stop sharing and give you the ability to unmute or type your questions in the chat. So thank you. We're all speechless. Any questions out there?
Hi, this is Adrian. I have a question.
Hey.
Oh, there I am. Okay. Yeah. So I was just out in my front yard the other day, and this mother and child, maybe 12-year-old, was walking by. And of course, I started talking to them about the native plants in my front yard and stuff. Well, we're right down the street from a park that has a small stream. And after a while, I realized that the girl was carrying an empty, big, tall glass kind of terrarium type thing. And I said, "Oh, what's that?" And the mom said, "Oh, well, we just released a frog down by the stream." And I kind of looked at her and she said, "Oh, it wasn't an invasive species or anything like that. It was like the ones down at the stream." And so it took me aback, and I had just met them and I was trying to, build bridges. And so I didn't really say anything. And do you have any other suggestions?
Yeah, that's a tough subject, and something that I also dealt with a lot in my former position, working with a lot of schools, is that some folks do the raise and release of things like bullfrogs, because you can buy the life cycle kits online, raise them up, and then they think the natural thing is to release the adults into the wild. So there are a couple problems, as you've identified. One of them is actually a legal issue. So in Maryland, you can collect certain native species from the wild, but if they've been in captivity for more than 30 days, you are not legally allowed to release them without a permit. Obviously, telling a mom and their kids that it's illegal to release that pet frog probably isn't going to land very well. So I try to think of it, frame it in a way that getting them to think about the frog and its care. It seems like a really nice idea to release a captive frog into the wild, but just like our domestic animals, they're used to you giving them their food, they're used to you providing their habitat and all of that. And not all of them survive when released out into the wild. And usually it's kind of like a slow, not so great way. So framing it in terms of empathy towards that animal, and that if it's raised in captivity, it's just like my guinea pigs. They're not going to last more than a day outside, if that, maybe about 2 hours for guinea pigs. So, so because they're people are going to find out that if it's not helping the frog and hurting them to do that release, it might be easier for them to understand that instead of going through, well, it's illegal, well, you're probably spreading disease to other animals and all the other laundry list of things that you could go through. So does that help?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome. All right, I see a question in the chat from Jennifer, and they ask, what is a good way to observe amphibians in the wild? Sit by a stream or a wetland, look under rocks? That's an excellent question, Jennifer. And this is one that we've been talking about at the park level. We actually just formed an ethical herping task team just on this subject, and not just, how to observe amphibians, but how to interact with amphibians. And do it in an ethical and sustainable manner. So in the herp world, and it's even something that I grew up with, it's just like you see a frog, you gotta catch it. You see a turtle, you gotta pick it up, right? It's just that instant, like, oh, I gotta touch it, because you can't really do that with wild mammals and wild birds and all of that. But herps, it's just such a natural thing to touch it. But then what we're finding out is that touching them as an easy way to transfer disease. It's an easy way to transfer whatever's on our hands. Think about all the hand sanitizer and other chemicals from lotions and stuff like that we might have on our skin that gets transferred to our amphibians. And also the stress of the animal. Even a box turtle, picking them up does elicit a bit of a stress response. And so we've been thinking about ways to reframe how people typically go out to herp and do a little bit more of this passive observation of going out and sitting and listening to them, or looking for them when they're most active. So this time of year, the frogs and a lot of the salamanders are super active on these wet nights. So if you can go to those areas where they're out and about, you don't have to flip rocks or flip logs to look for them. You can listen for them, and just even on roads, you can see them crossing the roads and all of that. So more of that passive observation and trying to handle them only when you need to handle them. And this is something that, again, I've been grappling with this myself, trying not to handle things like it's just so natural to like want to touch it. We're very tactile type of folks, especially in the naturalist world. But yes, so going out, doing that passive observation. There are places that are also doing a lot of herp hikes right now. So check out some of your local nature centers and all of that. They might have a vernal pool hike or a herp hike. I feel like Patapsco or Seneca, one of the state parks has a herp hike that's coming up this weekend. And so that's a great way to go out to these places and go on a guided hike and look for them. So if you're going to do things like flipping rocks and flipping logs, some of the things just to consider is don't flip them all. So be intentional about the things that you're choosing to flip. Don't try to flip these things that are going to fall apart, like logs that are going to fall apart when you flip them, because if it's too far decomposed and you flip it and it falls apart, then you've completely destroyed that animal's home, that whole micro ecosystem under there. And I know it's not intentional, but it's easy to do. And I did it this weekend. The one log that I flipped looking for a salamander, the whole thing fell apart, and I just stood there and I was like, I'm so sorry. And I did not flip anymore, even though it's prime season to look for them. I was just like, I don't want to hurt this habitat anymore. So think about those impacts and make sure if you're putting the log, always put the log or the rock back down. Make sure you're putting it back down in the area where it originally was and doing it carefully so you don't accidentally crush anybody who's underneath of it. So it's a really long-winded question or answer to your question, but we are working on some guidelines at the national level. And we'll have some information out there, but it's a slow process to try to develop all of that too. So, all right. Hopefully that helped answer your question, Jennifer. So I see the next question is from Diana, and is it still important to disinfect boots if it's a weeks in between uses and sites? Yes, it is very important to disinfect these things. And as I said earlier, this disinfection, these processes, a lot of the ones that have been developed with the Partners in Amphibian Reptile Conservation, they're going to kill a lot more than just herp diseases. They're going to kill other things. And I really, this really hit home for me when I was up in Maine this summer, because there is beach blight disease, which is, there's a beach leaf disease. There's a disease that's killing the beech trees in Maine and in some northern states. And if you know anything about trees, beech is like a super common tree in a lot of our forests up and down the East Coast. And this thing is just wiping out these trees up in these northern areas, and it's spread by a nematode. So after I got home from hiking in Maine, you better believe I was scrubbing down all of my boots and all of my stuff and making my husband scrub down his shoes too, because I was like, I don't want to be that potential person to accidentally introduce this nematode to Maryland, right? So this process is going to help for more than just herps. It's also going to help with the other things that might travel on our clothing and our boots. And the link that I have in the Wakelet has like a little disinfection table, and it should also take you to the park website. We have a newly updated video this year that also has the most recent information on how to disinfect. But, excuse me, essentially what you're doing is scrubbing any like soil and stuff off the shoes, applying a light bleach solution, letting it sit, and then rinsing that bleach solution off really well with water. That's going to be your standard disinfection protocol. So, okay, well, lots of questions. Sorry, I'm taking too long to answer them. So Kathleen says, what are some ways I can encourage salamanders and frogs to come into my yard? And that's a great question. So Northeast Park actually has a little brochure on how to create backyard habitat for reptiles and amphibians. But some of the things to think about is increasing the amount of habitat that they can use. So a lot of our salamanders that are going to hang out in yards are going to be using decaying logs and places like that have a lot of leaf litter and stuff like that to live under, and also to eat the invertebrates underneath. So making sure you've got that nice cover in terms of rotting logs and leaf litter in certain areas. And also just reducing pesticides, that'll help out your local frogs and salamanders. And if you could have some type of fishless water source, whether it be a small pond or something of that nature, fish are major predators of amphibians when they're breeding. So having a pond with fish in it won't help them, but something that doesn't have fish in it could be a really good spot for your local salamanders and frogs. So. And next question is from Marianne. Do freezing pond temperatures affect wood frog eggs? She noticed that there was ice on the pond after mating, but hasn't been back. That's a great question. I'm not sure how eggs react to freezing. I know that the wood frogs themselves can freeze. And I imagine because they're some of our early breeding species, that their eggs probably have some type of protectant, but I'm not 100%, so I'll just say that I'm not sure. And I see a question from Anna. I'm in New Jersey. Are there any groups you know of that bring animals around to educate communities and kids on these issues? Great question, Anna. I would suggest reaching out to your local nature centers and also to like your state parks. A lot of state parks across the United States have like unreleasable wildlife that they can do education programming with. And so I know like within state parks here in Maryland, they have a lot of unreleasable birds of prey, like owls and even vultures and hawks. And then some of them also have turtles and snakes and things like that. And they would be great ambassadors to come into the classroom or to different areas. So Alex asks, do you know when the Amphibian Week event will be happening at the National Zoo? Yes, the National Zoo. So the National Zoo and the Natural History Museum, those events are happening May 5th and May 4th and May 5th. And I want to say the zoo is on Sunday the 5th. Both of them are going to be midday events. We don't have the exact times. We're meeting next week, so I'm hoping we can get some of those times up on the website very soon. All right, I think I hit all the questions, and if I missed yours, please let me know. All right, awesome. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Patty, and the Frederick Nature Council Frederick County Nature Council for inviting me to speak. So really appreciate it.
Okay, well, Kerry, we really appreciate you coming and speaking with us. As always, it's been really entertaining and very, very educational, and it's something I think everybody appreciates. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Before we end, I'd like to tell you about our coming events. Tonight's webinar is part of an ongoing quarterly series. On June 5th, Taylor Roman, who is a farmer and environmental educator, will be presenting Blossoms and Bees, exploring 150 million years of plant pollinator evolution. And on September 4th, Gemma Radko of the American Bird Conservancy will be discussing bird migration. So we hope to see you then, and I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and have a good night.